Hello and good afternoon, everyone. So like Joanne mentioned, I'm going to be talking briefly about how evidence and gap maps can be used to identify equity issues and how these equity issues can help develop design and research for further systematic reviews and also identify gaps in terms of primary studies and impact evaluation. So I'm going to be taking two examples from the evidence and gap maps that I've led. One is on people with disabilities and other on child well-being, which was a mega map, and we'll take you through these questions. But before I get on to the equity issues directly, let me quickly talk about use of evidence and gap maps. So what you see here on the screen is something what we call a strategic approach to building evidence architecture. And this is from a paper by Howard White, the CEO of Campbell Collaboration. And what it basically tells you is, if you see the top three levels of the evidence architecture, it's basically, these are called as evidence decision-making products that are actually helpful to inform decision-making without having to actually go back and read the full paper or full systematic reviews. But the main point here is that to get to that top three level, you really need to have a stronger base, because without that, you cannot really develop the top level of the evidence pyramid. And evidence and gap maps are actually the link between the top level and the bottom level of it. The main reason is because evidence and gap maps, they help you or provide you a survey of how much evidence is actually available on a particular sector or a particular topic. So it will help you identify the areas of high quality evidence, as well as it will help you identify areas of evident gaps, both absolute and both in terms of evidence synthesis. But what is also interesting to note here is that EGMs are not usually an end, so that it's not like you develop an EGM and then forget about it, but they're actually important and a step to do further works. And also, importantly, evidence and gap maps are key tools because they are living tools. You can actually, the idea is to keep on annually updating them so that the evidence that you generate on a particular sector is actually living and it's actually most updated version. Typically, evidence and gap maps, they are in the form of matrix of interventions and outcomes. And I'm talking about effectiveness evidence and gap maps here. And the main purpose of evidence and gap maps is to highlight the areas of evidence concentration, which I've highlighted here in the green, and highlight the areas of evident gaps that you can see highlighted in red. And the snapshot that you see here on the screen is from a Violence Against Children Evidence and Gap Maps, which was then done in collaboration with UNICEF and Ashrita. And I was one of the co-authors. Now, if we talk about equity, before I get to that, I would like to mention that for an evidence and gap map, the framework is extremely important. And this framework is basically formed of two dimensions. One is called as the primary dimensions of the map, and the second is called as the secondary dimension of the map. When we say primary dimensions of the map, these corresponds to your interventions and outcomes. And you can incorporate equity in primary dimension itself in the form of having equity focused outcomes or having specific interventions that are dealing with the equity issues. In the form of secondary dimensions, which are also called as filters in an evidence and gap map, you can have filters in the form of study design. Now you can incorporate equity in study design as well. And I'll give you an example. So for example, when we talk about people with disability evidence and gap map, if we go ahead and set our inclusion criteria to only randomized controlled trial, we are going to actually miss out on a number of key studies that are required for or that are important for people with disabilities. So we expanded our inclusion criteria for this particular map, and we included study designs like quasi-experimental studies as well as single subject study design. Reason because most of the rehabilitation studies, they are in the form of single subject research design. So whenever you're thinking about equity and evidence mapping, these are the small key areas that you have to keep in mind. The secondary dimension that are usually in most of the evidence and gap maps that can have equity component are country and region. So when we talk about region, we also should keep in mind about where exactly are the low-income countries and whether do we have evident gaps in low-income areas or not. Similarly, population subgroup is of course something that we have to keep in mind when we are setting up PCOs to include the equity components in our evidence and gap maps. I'll give you examples as we go ahead with the two maps. But the majority of maps consider equity in two ways. This is again important. One is in which we generate an evidence and gap map that maps studies of effect with an explicit equity focus. That is on a specific dimensions of an equity. It could be on a disadvantaged population. The example is interventions for people with disabilities, because people with disabilities are already disadvantaged for a number of reasons. The second example and the most common ways is to have evidence and gap maps that map studies of effect which are not explicitly aimed at reducing inequity, but presents data that are disaggregated by gender and disability. We have several examples from Campbell, 3i that have these kinds of map. One example that I can give you is evidence and gap map on road safety interventions in LMICs. I can also say mega map in child well-being, because when you say children altogether, there are certain sections of children that definitely they are more disadvantaged. What is equally important when we say equity consideration in mapping is, of course, the stakeholder considerations play an important role whenever you're setting your framework, both the primary and secondary dimensions, and you want to include equity component in that. Important criteria would be, we have to be very careful while setting our inclusion and exclusion criteria, so that we include categories that includes disadvantaged population in the form of socioeconomic status, race, gender, and elements of progress plus, of course. We have to be very sure that we develop equity-focused search strategy that includes databases, terms, concepts that are relevant to equity questions. And of course, we need to have equity filters for the presentation of the maps. I would also like to mention in the form of to develop a standardized data extraction form to code studies for the countries, of course, where they are conducted, to code the studies for interventions and outcomes based on the framework or the sector that you're working on. And more importantly, to have the attention to equity. I'll give you an example from the mega map on child well-being that we developed. So this mega map was basically developed using the UNICEF strategic goals. So they have 5 strategic goals. One of the strategic goals, which is called as goal area 5, is called as every child has an equitable chances in life. So in this particular brief, we only included studies that explicitly focused on equity component for the child well-being, and we have a separate brief to that. So whenever you're planning your analysis right from your PICOs, you also need to keep in mind whether related to your sector area, if you would like to include something or equity component, and we need to give a separate analysis for that or not. Like I mentioned, for both of these maps, we developed a search to include the equity component. The idea is to make our searches sensitive as well as equity focused. So we included terms related to social disadvantage and socioeconomic status. We also included specific terms related to vulnerable population, and of course, different variants of equity, inequity, disparity, and also these were referred back to the databases or specific databases, and of course, to the information specialists to identify the searches. What is also important, like I mentioned, is to set our inclusion and exclusion criteria to include a population segment that are most disadvantaged for the interventions that we are studying and also for the sector that we are studying. It could be including anything from gender to occupation to educational level or place of residence as well. Coming back to the disability evidence and gap map, and I'm going to show you two quick examples of the analysis that we did in this and how we used it further. So the disability evidence and gap map basically mapped all the effectiveness studies for people with disabilities in LMICs. The interventions and outcome framework for people with disabilities were based on WHO's community-based rehabilitation matrix. And of course, we included the people with disabilities as a population, but we also went ahead and included traditionally underrepresented groups like women, children in care, conflict settings, migrants, and people belonging to ethnic minorities, because they are considered to be more disadvantaged. And of course, the prevalence of disabilities tend to be higher in those population subgroups. So this is the snapshot of people with disabilities map that included 110 reviews and 164 impact evaluations. We did analysis on the population subgroup as well as we presented into the online map. So you can see on the left-hand side is basically a snapshot from the online map. And what you see on the right-hand side is basically an analysis. You can clearly see that there are key equity gaps here in terms of we do not have specific studies on people specifically for women in this area or people belonging to migrant or conflict affected or humanitarian settings. So we identified these key gaps, not just in terms of the population subgroup, but also in terms of the interventions and outcomes. And then we did the analysis based on the population as well. That identified that we had very few studies that were focusing on social inclusion, interventions that actually lead to the inclusion of people with disabilities, and also that lead to the livelihood and educational outcomes for people with disabilities. So as a result of the finding of these maps, we went ahead and did 3 systematic reviews that were entirely based on this evidence and gap map. We did not went ahead and did any additional searches. All these studies were identified from the map itself, and we went ahead and did 3 systematic reviews. One of them is already out for peer review. 2 of them are currently ongoing. The next is the mega map on child well-being. This is, like I mentioned, was based on, the framework is based on UNICEF goal area. These were 5 goal areas here. And as a result of this map, there were 2 important things that we did. One is, of course, we identified a brief that was specifically focusing on equity. But since this map is annually updated, and for the 2020 update, we went ahead and also did 1 additional brief, which was on COVID-19, because at that time it was the need of the hour. And that brief is currently already out and published, and we are doing 2021 update for that. So this is basically the snapshot from that child well-being map. And currently we have 475 systematic reviews in this and 25 evidence and gap maps, out of which we identified 9 COVID-19 specific evidence and gap map in this. So if I again go back and talk about the population categories and analysis in terms of the population subgroups, you can clearly see that there are key equity gaps in terms of children from conflict affected regions, children from disabilities, from underrepresented communities, and of course malnourished children. And even if you look at the women and girls, most of these studies were from South Asia, but they were again restricted to only a few countries. So there were a lot of regional gaps as well among all of these areas. Like I mentioned, we went ahead and did the explicit analysis based on equity. We identified 22 systematic reviews and 7 EGMs that were explicitly focusing on equity in terms of people with disabilities, or depending upon ethnicity, race, and caste, and of course indigenous children. This was the COVID-19 specific brief, where we identified 50 studies on pandemics and epidemics, and 3 studies focusing on financial crisis and natural disasters. The 2021 update is ongoing. I think I'm going to go quickly here because I think I'm a bit over time. But the need for equity generated or equity focused evidence and gap map lies in 2 important aspects. If we do not do equity focused evidence gap maps, or we do not give analysis based on equity, there are chances that researchers and decision makers will always be unaware where exactly are the key gaps in terms of the equity. Evidence and gap maps like this, and I think there are a number of organizations that are now promoting and doing this equity related analysis in their evidence and gap map, 3i and Campbell to name a few, is actually help highlight the key equity gaps so that the researchers and decision makers or funders, they can take those areas and we can have more systematic reviews or primary studies in those areas. And hence there is a need to advocate equity focused, not just equity focused reviews, but also equity focused evidence and gap maps. And these are some of the points in which how these EGMs can help build these gaps, because they help identify relevant research, both in terms of the gaps and also highlight the high quality systematic reviews that are equity focused. So when I talk about the people with disability or mega map, both of them had at least 2 or 3 high quality systematic reviews that have some focus related to equity, either disaggregated data or explicit equity focus. So you can see that it's not enough. We only identify a handful of studies and handful of high quality studies in those sectors. So there's clearly a need to generate more high quality evidence in this sector. And with that note, I'm going to end my presentation, and I look forward to questions either now or towards the end in the panel discussion, to answer a few questions. Thank you.